Why does your game still feel dead, even though so much of it is already working? You can spend months improving movement, cleaning visuals, and refining the lighting. Then, finally, you hit play and see the same quiet disappointment. Players notice that immediately. They might never say it in those words, but they feel like it. They feel it when the environment never answers them back. They feel it when the sound sits on top of the game instead of coming from inside of it. They feel it when the world seems to only exist at the exact moment where they touch it. So this video is about that problem. I think there are three pillars deciding whether a game feels alive. Once you start looking at them in your own project, a lot of the problems that seem vague right now suddenly become a lot more concrete. When people talk about immersion in games, they usually start with surface level stuff. It's better graphics, better shaders, and more detail. Those can all help, but it's rarely the reason a game feels alive. A game starts to really feel alive when the player gets a sense of that the world has its own internal order, so it does not just sit there waiting for the player. It feels like something has already happened, even before the player arrives. Once you start paying attention to this, you can see how a lot of great games incorporate this and solve this in deliberate ways. For example, Half-Life keeps the story inside the world instead of constantly cutting away from you, which is a huge part of why it feels so great to play. Ghost of Tsushima has a special way of navigation because the guidance that they bring you is really physical instead of abstract like in most games. And another great example is The Witness. They explained that the team specifically held back the music on purpose because the game was about paying attention to subtle details in the world itself. Those are very different games, but they are all doing the same deeper thing. They keep the player immersed inside their world. So let's get more concrete. There are three pillars I keep coming back to here, and the first one is reaction. The moment a player enters a space, the world should begin to answer them in some form. That answer might come through sound, movement, behavior, or particles. What matters is that the game stops feeling passive. This is one of the reasons Red Dead Redemption 2 leaves such a strong impression on people. It keeps feeding the player these tiny confirmations that their presence matters. Animals shift when you get close. NPCs react to you, how you behave, and what happened nearby. And none of that works because each reaction is huge. It works because the game almost never lets the world feel indifferent. The same idea shows up in Breath of the Wild too, just in a different form. Nintendo built the game around systems that can interact with each other, so weather, fire, metal, terrain, and physics can combine in ways that make the world feel responsive instead of just scripted. Nintendo even described that design goal in terms of letting countless events occur so players can decide their own solution. And this is where a lot of games lose their life. The player can jump, shoot, drive, drift, collect, and interact, but the world almost absorbs none of it. Everything is built around the player output, but the environment gives nothing of that back. And this is why the first pillar matters so much. Players need evidence that the world noticed them. It doesn't have to be expensive or complex. In fact, some of the best examples are tiny. It could be an echo in a larger space, a change in footstep texture when the ground changes, foliage that moves away when the player runs into them. And these things are small in isolation, but together they tell the player that the world is awake. Players will always forgive simple art much faster than they will forgive bad sound. Sound is the part that tells your brain whether a place has scale, density, weather, distance, and everything else. It gives your place, whichever you are in, shape, because the player hasn't even processed what they look at and they can already hear and feel the environment. And you can hear this clearly in games that understand this at a really deep level. Skyrim, for example, does this way before anything dramatic happens. It's wind that moves across open terrain, the rooms that change the character of your footsteps, and the world is constantly telling you what kind of place you are standing in. And The Witness got this even further in the opposite direction. The team wrote that the game isn't about listening to music, it's about being perceived, about noticing subtle details in puzzles and environment, and that's exactly why the game doesn't lean on constant music. It wants the island to carry the experience. And that's such an important point because it shifts the question. The real question isn't if you have good sound effects. The real question lies in whether your game has an identity with its sound. So if I close my eyes, would I still know where I am? If I'm in a shop or outside? And if your answer is no, then it may look really finished, but it sounds really bad. So that's a good thing to work on. Ghost of Tsushima is a great example of how far this can go. When sound and world motion work together, they built the world around multiple systems to support the illusion that real wind was moving through the world. In the GDC talk, they explained that the cloth, particles, trees, and even the millions of grass blades were all reacting to the wind, so it would feel believable. And that is why the game feels so natural. It's not pasted into the world, it becomes a good part and a good portion of it. And that's why the second pillar is really important, and that's what it's all about. Your game doesn't just need sound, it needs an identity for itself. And with that comes pillar 3. You can have reactive systems and strong sound, but still lose players if the rest of the game pulls against those strengths. A world feels alive when all those layers work together. The art has to support the tone, the mechanics have to support the fantasy, the animation has to support the physicality of everything. And when those layers line up, the player settles into the world. They just stop noticing the seams and start enjoying more of the experience. A good example of this, which many of you might have played, is Half-Life, because it has good perspective, level design, and storytelling, and they all reinforce the same feeling. The story doesn't just arrive in a separate layer, it happens in front of you, around you, behind you, while you are in that world, and that's a huge reason the game feels direct instead of indirect. Bioshock works the same way, but from a different angle. What makes Rapture so memorable is not simply the lore, it's the environment that keeps the same story in multiple directions. It has architecture, style, damage, advertising, all of it points back to the same collapsed ideology. You do not have to just stop and read a design document to understand the place. You feel the history in what they created. Your game starts to feel alive when the player can directly read meaning from what they see. You connected everything together and it becomes really coherent. And that matters because it widens your whole perspective on how your game looks. Presence is rarely created through one big feature. It comes from many smaller systems that work together. Once that clicks, a lot of your design decisions stop looking so problematic, and you can suddenly see why one thing works and the other one doesn't, and how it makes your game feel hollow, even the individual pieces seem to align on their own. I run into this in my own work all the time. The build works, the core mechanic is there, and on paper the project should already feel good. But then you play it and the whole thing feels really thin. And most of the time, the reason is not that mysterious. The world exists, but the player just touches it. And outside that narrow strip of interaction, there is no pressure, no residue, and nothing that suggests that the place runs on its own. Once you start noticing that, you can fix it and you can feel the difference immediately. A location feels more distinct because you have different sound, the path becomes more memorable, and all of that changes behavior. Players can maybe slow down, listen, notice, and they remember places instead of just remembering the mechanics. So if your game feels that right now, you should come back to the 3 pillars. First, your world has to react. Then your game has to have an audio identity. And third, every layer needs to point in the same direction. Once you have that, the problem gets much easier to diagnose. You can stop trying to finish your game through random polish. You can start building it through different interactions. And the useful part of this is making a game feel alive is hard, but it's not magic. You don't need an infinite budget to fix these issues. Players can feel the changes that you make really fast. So I'm curious, Which of these 3 pillars is your game missing right now? Write it in the comments, and if there's a game that nails one of these pillars better than anything else, mention that too, because best examples are usually very, very specific. If you want more videos like this, subscribe, and if you want to support what I'm building, Wishlist Treasure Drift on Steam. And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next one.